Operation LAC, spraying an entire nation in the decades after World War II, a new battlefield emerged, one invisible, airborne, and impossible to mark on a map. It was a fog of particles and germs, drifting over cities and countryside, carried by wind and weather into the lungs of millions. And much of it was released by the government sworn to protect those same people. This is the story of Operation LAC, large area coverage, a Cold War program in which the US Army tested how biological or chemical agents would spread over vast regions of the United States. Carried out from the late 1940s into the 1960s, LAC involved aircraft dispersing microscopic traces across hundreds of miles to map their movement, persistence, and penetration into urban populations. Officially, the goal was scientific: to understand aerosol dispersion, to prepare defenses, and to know how an enemy might weaponize the air. In practice, the tests blurred the line between defense and experiment. Cities like Minneapolis, St. Louis, and the entire Midwest breathed invisible clouds of zinc, cadmium sulfide, and other compounds, substances later linked to environmental and health concerns, without their consent. In other operations, live bacteria were used as stand-ins for pathogens, exposing unwitting civilians to organisms the military treated as research tools. Operation LAC is not just a chapter in military history. It is a moral test. How far can a state go when fear of an unseen enemy overrides the rights of its own citizens? It asks us to remember that the most dangerous experiments are those conducted without permission, in the name of national security. Welcome to Secrets of the Battlefield. This is Operation LAC, the program that sprayed a nation to learn how to hurt or to heal, and the consequences the country still grapples with today. Chapter 1: Origins and Rationale. At the dawn of the Cold War, fear was not measured in soldiers or tanks, but in microbes. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but scientists and generals already imagined the next one, a war fought not with explosions, but with invisible clouds that could cripple cities in hours. In 1949, the United States began a secret effort to understand this new kind of warfare: biological weapons. Behind locked doors in military laboratories, researchers studied how diseases like anthrax, tularemia, and plague might spread if released by an enemy aircraft. To prepare for that threat, the US Army decided it needed data, real data, on how airborne particles traveled across the land. That was the birth of Operation LAC, short for Large Area Coverage. The idea came from a simple but chilling question: how large an area could a single aircraft contaminate? The first experiments were small and cautious. Scientists at the Army Chemical Corps and Fort Detrick began releasing harmless tracer particles into the air, measuring how far they spread using ground sensors. But soon, harmless took on a broader definition. Instead of testing in laboratories or empty deserts, the Army chose populated regions, places where wind, humidity, and geography could mimic real wartime conditions. By the early 1950s, military aircraft were flying at night over American cities, releasing fine mists of zinc, cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent compound used to trace the flow of air currents. The particles were microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, but easily detected under ultraviolet light. They could drift for hundreds of miles. To scientists, it was elegant. To history, it was reckless. The Army justified the program as defensive research. If the US was to survive a Soviet biological attack, they argued, it needed to understand how agents dispersed, where they would travel, how long they would linger, and how to detect them before they killed. But what the public didn't know was that the experiments weren't just happening on military bases. They were happening over homes, schools, and hospitals. Cities like Minneapolis, St. Louis, and Corpus Christi became open-air laboratories. In 1952, canisters mounted on aircraft sprayed clouds of zinc, cadmium sulfide over 11 states, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. Sensors were placed in neighborhoods, parks, and even inside buildings to record how much of the material settled. The results astonished military planners. Particles released over one city could be detected hundreds of miles away. In one test, a single aircraft flying along the east coast spread tracer materials detectable from Georgia to Maine. In another, the Army confirmed that entire regions could be blanketed by a single release under the right weather conditions. The data was invaluable, but the ethics were indefensible. No one had asked permission. No one had warned the public. And no one knew the long-term health effects of the materials being used. At the time, officials insisted zinc cadmium sulfide was non-toxic. Yet internal documents from the Chemical Corps show that some scientists raised concerns early on, noting the compound contained cadmium, a metal already known to be carcinogenic in laboratory animals. Still, the tests continued, larger, higher, and bolder. By 1957, Operation LAC had evolved into a nationwide experiment. Military aircraft, including the C-119 flying boxcar, began dispersing traces over thousands of square miles. Entire regions of the United States were quietly transformed into test grids for biological warfare studies. The Cold War had created a new logic, one where fear justified everything. The Army wasn't preparing to harm Americans, it told itself. It was preparing to save them from a future Soviet attack. But in doing so, it crossed a line that would remain invisible until decades later, when the truth began to surface, particle by particle, report by report. What began as science had already become something else, a moral experiment on a population that didn't know it was being studied. Chapter 2: The cities that were sprayed. By the mid-1950s, Operation LAC had shifted from small, isolated trials to something far larger, an unannounced, nationwide experiment. What began as cautious tests over remote areas evolved into full-scale dispersal missions over some of America's most populated cities. The Army called them field studies, but to those who later uncovered the truth, they were something else entirely: covert exposure experiments carried out on unwitting civilians. One of the first targets was St. Louis, Missouri, a city chosen because its crowded downtown and surrounding neighborhoods offered a perfect model for testing how aerosols would move through an urban environment. Between 1953 and 1965, military trucks equipped with spray nozzles released clouds of zinc cadmium sulfide from rooftops and street corners. Other times, aircraft flew overhead, dispersing fine mist into the city's humid air. The neighborhoods chosen were not random. They were predominantly low-income and African American communities, such as the Pruitt-to-Go housing project and surrounding blocks. Residents recalled a mysterious smoke that drifted through the streets, coating laundry and windowsills with a strange, metallic dust. No one told them what it was, and no one warned them to stay inside. In Minneapolis, similar tests took place. Military personnel sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide from tall buildings and monitored how the particles spread through the city's industrial corridor. In some cases, scientists placed collection devices in schools and hospitals, measuring how deeply the material penetrated into public spaces. To the Army, these neighborhoods were convenient, compact, easy to monitor, and filled with air sampling points that could be quietly maintained. Other tests were carried out along the Gulf Coast, stretching from Corpus Christi, Texas, up through Florida and into the Midwest. Aircraft flying from military bases dispersed the particles across hundreds of miles, allowing scientists to study how high-altitude winds could carry contaminants over entire states. One test, conducted in 1957, blanketed an area larger than Wisconsin. Tracer particles were later found more than 1,200 kilometers away. In each case, the people below had no idea. They lived their lives beneath invisible clouds, unaware that they were part of one of the largest biological dispersion experiments ever conducted in peacetime. To justify these actions, the Army insisted that zinc cadmium sulfide was harmless. In 1959, internal memos described it as non-toxic at all tested concentrations, but later studies suggested otherwise. Cadmium compounds were already known to cause cancer and kidney damage in laboratory animals. Some Army scientists expressed quiet concern, but their warnings were ignored. The Cold War left no room for hesitation. Meanwhile, the tests expanded into new territory, not just chemical traces, but bacterial simulants. Organisms such as Bacillus globigii and Serratia marchescens, considered harmless at the time, were released in subway systems, ports, and military bases to study how pathogens might spread. One test in San Francisco released a bacterial cloud that sickened dozens and killed at least one hospital patient. Still, the program continued. In total, Operation LAC and its related programs covered millions of people across dozens of states. Entire cities became test sites without consent, without warning, and without record of who might have been affected. Years later, when declassified documents revealed what had happened, residents were stunned. Some blamed unexplained health issues on the tests, others demanded investigations. A 1990s report by the National Research Council acknowledged that civilians had been exposed, though it stopped short of confirming lasting harm. For many, the damage wasn't only physical. It was psychological, the realization that the government had treated its own citizens as test subjects in a war that hadn't even started. Beneath the patriotic slogans and Cold War propaganda, a quieter truth lingered. America had sprayed its own people, not out of hatred, but out of fear, and fear, once weaponized, rarely stays contained. Chapter 3: The Science of Secrecy. In the Cold War's race for control, secrecy wasn't just a policy, it was a weapon. Every experiment, every document, every photograph that came out of Operation LAC was stamped, top secret. Only a handful of scientists, generals, and officials knew the full scope of what was being done. The rest of America lived in ignorance beneath the haze of its own government's fear. To those inside the project, the mission seemed justified. The Army Chemical Corps and Fort Detrick's Biological Warfare Division believed they were defending the nation from an invisible threat. Intelligence reports from the late 1940s warned that the Soviet Union was developing aerosolized anthrax and plague. If such an attack ever occurred, they needed to know how to respond, how far particles could travel, how quickly they would dissipate, and how to measure the danger. But in the pursuit of those answers, ethics were quietly suspended. Scientists developed a new logic, one that turned secrecy into science itself. If the public didn't know, they argued, then panic couldn't interfere with progress. If no one was told, no one could object. The data coming out of Operation LAC was extraordinary. The Army learned that aerosolized particles could travel hundreds of miles, passing over mountains and across borders. They learned that small urban canyons, alleys, streets, and skyscrapers could trap and amplify concentrations of airborne material. And most importantly, they learned that even tiny quantities of biological or chemical agents could infiltrate ventilation systems, reaching thousands of people before detection. The military called this knowledge for defense, but to many of the scientists involved, it was also a demonstration of power, proof that they could map and manipulate the atmosphere itself. As the tests continued, new departments were drawn into the program. The Atomic Energy Commission, the Public Health Service, and the U.S. Weather Bureau all provided assistance, each under the guise of environmental research. Weather balloons and aircraft collected air samples. Meteorologists helped model wind currents. The line between national defense and mass experimentation blurred beyond recognition. By 1958, Operation LAC had produced millions of data points. But what the scientists didn't collect, and didn't want to collect, were the human consequences. No long-term health studies were conducted. No follow-up surveys were made of the exposed populations. The official justification was chillingly simple: if the material was harmless, there was nothing to study. The secrecy surrounding the program became so dense that even members of Congress were unaware it existed. When journalists occasionally stumbled upon strange aircraft sightings or reports of fluorescent dust falling over towns, the military dismissed them as weather experiments. The deception worked for decades. Inside classified meetings, the program's directors celebrated the results. They had mapped the atmosphere of an entire continent, learned how to distribute materials with precision, and developed models that would later guide both civil defense plans and offensive biological warfare research. It was, by every internal metric, a success. Yet among the scientists at Fort Detrick, a quiet unease began to grow. Some of them had served during World War II, when the world condemned Nazi medical experiments for treating people as tools. Now, in their own laboratories, they were running tests that relied on the same principle: human subjects without consent. But no one spoke out. In an age of secrecy, silence was loyalty. And so Operation LAC continued, hidden behind a curtain of bureaucracy and patriotism, its records buried under layers of classification and code names. When it finally ended in the early 1960s, no public announcement was made. No report was released. The aircraft stopped flying, the canisters stopped spraying, and the world kept turning, unaware that the skies above had once been part of the largest biological dispersion experiment ever conducted on American soil. The scientists called it research. History would later call it something else, a quiet betrayal carried by the wind. Chapter 4: Exposure and Revelation. For more than 2 decades, Operation LAC remained buried beneath layers of classified paperwork, another invisible cloud drifting through history. Then, in the 1970s, the first cracks began to appear. A new generation of journalists, scientists, and veterans started asking questions about strange military projects from the early Cold War years. Among the fragments they uncovered was a phrase that kept repeating: large area coverage tests. The discovery came at a time when the American public's trust in government was already eroding. The Vietnam War had revealed deep deception, and the Watergate scandal had shown that secrecy was not always in the public's interest. In that atmosphere of suspicion, the idea that the US military had sprayed chemicals and bacteria over its own citizens without consent sounded like conspiracy, until the documents proved otherwise. In 1977, the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research held hearings on biological testing involving human subjects by the Department of Defense. It was during these hearings that Operation LAC, along with related projects like Operation Sea Spray in San Francisco and Operation Dew along the coasts, was publicly confirmed for the first time. Witnesses testified that aircraft and ground vehicles had released zinc, cadmium, sulfide, and bacterial agents across vast regions of the country. Senators were told that millions of people had been exposed, often repeatedly, and that the data had been used to simulate biological warfare scenarios. The Pentagon's representatives insisted the materials were harmless. But when asked to produce toxicology reports proving that claim, they had almost nothing to show. The studies had never been done. Officials admitted, under oath, that they had no long-term health data and that some of the substances contained cadmium, a known carcinogen. The hearing room fell silent. For the first time, the public glimpsed the full scale of what had happened. Declassified maps showed test zones stretching from the Rocky Mountains to the East Coast. Flight paths crossed over Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Minneapolis. The program had not been a few isolated tests, it had been a systematic, nationwide operation. The revelations sparked outrage, but they also revealed something deeper, a bureaucratic indifference that ran through decades of Cold War research. To the officials who had authorized LAC, it wasn't cruelty, it was calculation. Every decision had been justified by the phrase national security. Every ethical boundary had been crossed quietly, in the name of preparedness. Communities began demanding answers. In St. Louis, residents who had lived near the spraying sites filed petitions, demanding medical studies and compensation. Many pointed to unusually high cancer rates in the neighborhoods where the zinc, cadmium, sulfide had been released. Mothers remembered seeing white mist drift past their windows, thinking it was fog or industrial smoke. Now, decades later, they wanted to know what had really fallen from the sky. The Environmental Protection Agency and National Research Council launched limited investigations in the 1990s. Their official conclusions stated that exposure levels were unlikely to have caused harm. but their data came from incomplete records and excluded the poorest neighborhoods where the tests were most concentrated. To many, it felt less like closure and more like denial. Meanwhile, newly declassified documents painted a haunting picture of the mindset that had guided these programs. One 1950 memo from the Army's Chemical Corps described urban test populations as ideal human environments for controlled aerosol measurement. Another called the experiments an economical substitute for foreign testing. There were no apologies. No public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a quiet admission that the tests had happened, and that their legacy would remain uncertain. By the end of the hearings, the message was clear. Operation LAC was not an isolated episode. It was part of a broader pattern, one where secrecy had been used to transform ordinary citizens into data points. Unlike the microscopic particles once sprayed across the sky, the truth had finally drifted into the open, impossible to contain and impossible to forget. Chapter 5 Legacy and Lessons. Today, the story of Operation LAC sits at the uneasy crossroads of science, secrecy, and morality, a reminder of how easily fear can bend the rules of what is right. The tests that once drifted silently across the American sky are now part of a long, uncomfortable legacy, the use of ordinary citizens as unwitting participants in national defense experiments. In the decades since its revelation, Operation LAC has become a symbol, not just of Cold War paranoia, but of the blind faith governments placed in secrecy as a tool of security. The military called it research. Historians now call it what it was, an ethical failure disguised as science. For the scientists who designed the tests, the justification was simple. They believed that to protect a nation from biological warfare, they needed to understand how such an attack might unfold. They saw themselves as guardians of survival, not violators of trust. But intentions cannot erase consequences. And when secrecy replaces consent, even the noblest mission becomes corruption. When the program ended in the 1960s, no health studies were ever conducted on the populations that had been exposed. The data focused entirely on particle behavior, not on the people beneath it. It wasn't until decades later that residents of St. Louis, Minneapolis, and other test cities began connecting the dots between unexplained illnesses and the strange mists of their youth. Whether those health effects were truly caused by the experiments remains debated, but the emotional toll is undeniable. Communities that once trusted the institutions above them now saw betrayal written across the sky. In government archives, the reports of Operation LAC read like scientific triumphs, charts, equations, and dispersion models, all devoid of humanity. They never mention the mothers who watched white clouds roll through their streets, or the children who played beneath them. They never record the silence that follows when science forgets to ask for permission. The lessons of Operation LAC reach far beyond the Cold War. They remind us that secrecy breeds distance, a gap between those who decide and those who endure the consequences. They remind us that the phrase, "for your protection," has often been used to justify what should never have been done. And they reveal that the most dangerous weapon of the atomic age wasn't radiation or disease. It was the belief that survival justified everything. Today, as new forms of surveillance, biotechnology, and aerosol research emerge, the moral questions raised by Operation LAC have never been more relevant. Who decides what is safe? Who consents on behalf of the public? And how much are we willing to sacrifice in the name of security before we become our own test subjects again? Over half a century later, the winds that once carried microscopic particles of zinc cadmium sulfide across the Midwest have long since dissipated. But the idea behind them, that fear can justify secrecy, and secrecy can erase accountability, still lingers in the air. Operation LAC was never about war. It was about preparation. But in preparing for the worst, the United States performed an experiment on itself. One that proved not how far a chemical cloud could travel, but how far trust could fall before it was gone completely. The fog above us, they called it science. They called it defense. But to the millions who never knew they were part of an experiment, it was simply the air they breathed. Operation LAC was not a battle fought with soldiers or guns. It was fought with particles, unseen, unnamed, and unacknowledged. A war waged in silence, where every gust of wind carried both data and betrayal. In the name of protection, a government turned its own sky into a laboratory. It measured winds, counted molecules, and forgot people. It proved that fear, when combined with secrecy, can make any action seem reasonable, even when it drifts into the lungs of a nation. Decades later, the reports are declassified. The scientists are gone. But the lesson remains: the greatest danger to humanity has never been the weapons we build, it's the belief that the end justifies the means. Some call Operation LAC a mistake. Others call it a necessity of its time. But history calls it a warning, that the next great experiment may not fall from the sky, but rise from our own indifference. The clouds have vanished. The air is clear. But the question still hangs there, invisible as ever. If it happened once, what stops it from happening again? Thank you for watching. If you believe history's darkest secrets deserve to be remembered, like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from the shadow side of the battlefield.